All right, everyone, if you would grab a seat in here, and welcome to those of you who are joining us online to our Bible Savvy workshop on the book of Genesis. We have about, maybe 20 or so people who are going to be here in the room, but we've got about 200 people who are joining us online. So this is a big community that's going on here, and I'm really, really excited for this, okay? So here's the big idea for why we're doing this workshop and some of the workshops we're going to do later in the year. Our big goal as a church this year is called Bible Every Day. And so it's really, really simple. It's right there in the name. Our goal is that each and every one of us would spend time in God's Word every single day. Like, it's a basic thing, Jesus says, people don't live by bread alone. They live by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And so we're supposed to, it's like food, you know what I mean? You don't go many days without eating. You feel it when you do, right? And so we want to become the sort of people that when we go for a long time, or even a part of a day, or 2 days, where we're like, I'm aching for God's Word. I need the Bible every single day. So that's what we're doing, trying to get in God's Word every day. The problem is, unlike your next meal, sometimes getting into God's Word can feel a little bit challenging. I don't know about you, but I look forward to the next meal. Like I'm thinking about that, and it's been a little while. I'm like, I'm going to have tacos tonight, and that's going to be good. But we've got to work to get to the place where we're saying, I can't wait to see what's next in here. And part of the challenge is we don't know how to enjoy this book enough. And part of the problem with enjoying it is that we get into it and we're like, I'm not sure I understand what's going on. And so my big goal today is to give you a more sense of enjoyment of the book of Genesis, so that as you're reading it, you want to read it. But to get you to a place of enjoyment, I got to help you understand it. Okay? So we are going to work on that. And I love doing these classes like this because this is my chance. Not that I don't get to do this when I preach, but this is my chance to just go full-on Bible geek and just have a good time with what I love. And if you don't like it, it doesn't matter because I do, okay? So if we get into the weeds of weird stuff or we go off on a tangent or whatever, it doesn't matter because this is going to be so much fun, okay? So that's what we're doing today. Let me tell you how to get the most out of this workshop. It's a little different whether you're in the room or you're online. First is this. Highly encourage you to take notes, okay? Most people who sign up for a class like this are already ready to take notes, but if you aren't, it is worthwhile to go get a pen, go get a piece of paper, and actually take notes. And what I'd encourage you to do is not just try to capture everything I say or everything that's on the slides. You can take whatever you want. I will send out the slides to those of you who are registered for the class. We'll get that. We've got your contact information. We can send out the kind of PDF of those. So if there's something you missed, don't worry about that. What's most important during the time you're listening is probably to jot down questions that you have. So if you've got things that you say, that's really interesting, the things you learn most are the things that make you say, I want to know a little bit more about that. And so even just along the side where you're writing, if you jot down questions, that'll be helpful. There will be a few times over the course of this that I will stop and see if anybody has any questions. I do think that there might be a slight delay in the course of how the chat works online and those of us in the room. So because of that, when I stop and ask questions, I'll probably be able to get more from the room, but I will also respond to those who are texting in their questions on chat. So if you're online and along the way, even before I pause and do you have questions, you can be putting your questions in on the chat. I can see it here on a monitor in front of me. Second thing is this. I want you to participate in the activities I give you. This is not just going to be me lecturing about all of this stuff. There is going to be a lot of things that I'll say, but the way people learn, like the way our brains actually learn, is that when you hear something, even in this moment when you're like, that makes a whole lot of sense, Clayton, you are really hitting home with me, it feels good right now. You think you're learning, but in 90 minutes, the odds of you being able to say, what was that thing that Clayton said? Very, very little. But if you participate in something where you say, what do I think about that? And you actually express it, or you write it down, or you do something with it, those are the things that in a week or two or a month from now, you'll be able to say, I got that out of that. So the stuff you hear will fade quickly unless you do something with it. That's why taking notes, that's why participating in the activities. Some of the activities I do, I'm going to tailor a little bit for those in the room and those online. So if you are at home and you are just on your own, there may be things I say, we're going to have a conversation around tables. If you've got someone with you, you can have that conversation at home. But I'd encourage you, just jot down your thoughts. The point is to express it and to get it out. Don't just sit there and think. Actually put it down in some way. Third is this. Interact in the chat, okay? So if most people are at home doing this online. So if you want to have the interactive experience, go ahead and throw it in the chat. Like I said before, if you've got questions, you've got thoughts and feedback, I will from time to time look down here and say, hey, what's going on? And see what you've said. And so I already see some people who are saying hello, greeting everybody. Caitlin, Lori, Tasha, Jane, I can see all those people. So you go ahead and give me your thoughts and your questions as we do that. And here's the thing. I know everybody says this, but there are no dumb questions, okay? The reality is we're playing in Play-Doh today, all right? When you play in plaster or clay or something that's going to harden, you are really, really careful not to do something stupid and mess it up, right? But when you play in Play-Doh, you just make it, and if it messes up, you just do something else. This is a space where all the chat and stuff is not going to be recorded to post anywhere. It's just those of us who are participating who are doing this, and we're all learners here. And there are odds are you are going to ask me a question that I do not know the answer to, and you will hear me formulate something that is in Play-Doh that I'll say, I think it might be da-da-da-da-da, okay? So all of us have the permission to say, we are learners here. God's word is the teacher, and if we don't get it right the first time, we keep going back until we figure it out and learn and so on. So don't feel bad if you ask a question and you're like, I don't know about that. Odds are, many of us don't know about that, okay? It's totally cool. All right, let's try this out. If you are in chat, and those of you around your tables, if you want to turn to the person around you, well, actually, these only make sense if you're at home, so too bad for you guys in the room. If in chat, here's the question. How many people are with you right now? I'd love to find out, if you're with some people watching. And what are you eating or drinking right now? Unlike the people in the room, except for me, I have a little bit of water here, you probably have a snack. That's the cool thing about doing this at home. So let us know what you're eating and drinking. We'll come back to that in a little bit. All right, here are the goals for the workshop. First one is this. You will gain a broad understanding of the structure and themes of the book of Genesis, okay? The book of Genesis is actually the second longest book in the Bible, okay? You know what the longest book in the Bible is? Anybody in the room know what the longest book in the Bible is? Isaiah is a good guess. Did somebody say Jeremiah? Yes. Okay, Jeremiah is the longest book in the Bible by words. So the Psalms has the most chapters, but Jeremiah has the most words. But just behind it is the book of Genesis. This has a ton of content. So if you're in here thinking, I really hope that he explains that thing about Lot and his daughters, and that confuses me, it's like, well, odds are I'm not going to get to those things because there's just too much to get to. What I want to give you is so that when we start reading Genesis in the Bible Savvy reading plan on Monday, you've got a broad sense of here's how the book works, so that when you're in a particular passage, you kind of have the lay of the land. You're not just dropped in the middle of nowhere. You have a map, okay? That's the goal. Second goal is this. You will be able to use the comma method on a narrative passage of Scripture. If you don't know what comma is, I will explain that as we get to it, but it is our Bible reading method as a church that we teach here. We'll unpack it as we go. But my goal is that you will be able to do this particularly for a narrative, a story in the Bible. Because most of Genesis are stories, and it's different trying to understand and interpret a story than other parts of the Bible. So we're going to kind of tailor it. How do you read a story? Because most people think they can, but it's actually trickier than you think. So we're going to give you some tips on how to do that. Okay. Oh my goodness. We got someone eating ice cream. That's the benefit of being at home. All right, there we go. All right, I will tell you what the comma method is right now, actually, okay? So here's the first one. The C in comma stands for context. Context. You need to know the big picture of where the book is situated in context. O is observation. You actually just look at it. This is the funny thing. Most people, when they read the Bible, they think, oh, I don't understand it. But it's usually because they're skipping the first step and just doing what any of us can and say, it says this. Like, just what word is that? What do you see? What do you notice? It's very simple. You start there. You get so much understanding just by observing. Meditation. We're going to talk a little bit about this. If you have been around a while, you know that we used to teach the coma method, which is both brilliant and ridiculous at the same time. It's a great method, a terrible acronym, but we managed to fix it because some brilliant teenager was like, you could just add another M, and we could fix it. So we'll talk about what meditation means later on tonight. Then you formulate a message. This is when you actually say, all right, if I had to boil this down in one sentence, what's the principle? That's what you do. And then you form an application. Because the goal is not just to read what the Bible says and understand what it says, but to actually do what it says. To say, this is going to change my life. And so we're going to talk about how to go through this whole thing. The first half of today is going to be basically context, okay? So this is going to be about how the book of Genesis works. This is all the background stuff. It's the sort of stuff you might find in the introduction to a study Bible. When it's saying, let me give you the big overview of this, we're going to do a lot of that in the first hour of this session. We will get to the other 4 steps in the second half of this. All right. In chat and around your table, here's what I'd like you to do. Before I tell you anything more about the book of Genesis, I'd like you to identify what you know about the book of Genesis. So with the people around you or the people in your room or on chat, I'd like you to sum up the theme of Genesis in 2 or 3 words. Okay? You might want to unpack a little bit, but you don't have to feel like you need to do more than 2 or 3 words. Just identify what's the book about, the theme. Give you a minute to do that. All right. Go ahead and wrap that up. So I'm looking at the chat here, and a lot of people say things like creation and the fall, the beginning and sin, walking with God and the loss of that relationship, man's failure and God's promise to fix the relationship, creation and the introduction to Satan, the beginning. So a lot of things about the beginning and the fall, creation and sin entering the world. That's very good, very good. I'm going to give you some overview, and we're going to see if we can add anything to the list of those themes, because what I want to challenge us with is that I expected answers like the creation and the fall to be what the book of Genesis is about. But if you've looked at the book of Genesis, or you've read the accounts of the creation of the fall, even if you haven't read the rest of it, you know how many chapters it takes to get through those 2 stories? 3. How many chapters are in the book of Genesis? 50. Okay? So we're going to try to fill in the gap. Those answers are not wrong, but they're not complete. All right? So we're going to try to do that. All right, let me give you some context here. Who is the author of Genesis? Moses. Okay, this is the simple answer. The first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses, but it's complicated. And when you think about the book of Genesis, you can quickly see why it's complicated, okay? So Moses is about 500 years after the events of Genesis. And when you look at the creation of the world, many more years than that. So when you're just talking about like when the people we can date for sure, he's got several centuries. When you talk about the beginning of the world, he got a whole lot longer than that. And so you look at this and you say, how did Moses know some of these things? Like in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the deep. Who was there? Not Moses, right? Okay? So obviously Moses got this, but even the stories that come along later, stories about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, these are stories that, maybe Moses got, hey, God told him a bit about how the world was created, But most of these other stories, at the very least, were passed down from generation to generation. Moses wasn't the first one to write these things down or to speak these stories or know what happened in these things. And so Moses is doing a bit of history. Okay, the other books that Moses wrote, he was alive for those. But for this one, he's drawing on some old stories and putting them together and crafting them. More than that, we also see evidence within the book that someone after Moses went through and kind of, put some notes in. So there are occasions when there is the name of a place where it's like, it was called yada, 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 and it says, which today is now called whatever it is. There are mentions of people groups that traveled into that territory that weren't around in the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but came around later. And that would have been relevant for people who were after Moses. They would have known those people groups live in that area. There are details and little notes that make us say, okay, there were some stories that got passed down that Moses put together in this book, and then some people after Moses got a hold of that, and they were doing some commentary. Even things like this. The kind of Hebrew that the book of Genesis is written in was not the kind of Hebrew that was spoken in Moses' day, which means someone went through and at least updated it. It's sort of like if you were an English major and you ever had someone recite to you like from Beowulf or Chaucer, these like old and Middle English texts. You can like vaguely sort of make it out, but it's not really the same language anymore. Someone kind of updated it into modern, what became modern Hebrew in that. So whatever Moses wrote, someone came along and kind of, worked it as they went along. So why do I tell you all of this? Because I want you to hear it from me. Here's why. There are a whole lot of people who hear the absolutely true thing that this is God's word, it's trustworthy and reliable, and no one ever tells them about the human side of how we actually got this. What process that God used to give us this book? He had stories passed down from generation to generation. He had someone write it down, and he had people who followed up and edited and worked the text until we got what we got. There are a lot of people who hear that story from people who are critics of the Bible, especially of the book of Genesis, and they say, no one ever told me that. And they say, why didn't my pastor say something about that? Well, the reason your pastor didn't say that is because it gets tedious and boring sometimes when you're like, let me tell you about all this, editing and so on. And then people are freaked out when they haven't been told. So I'm telling you so that you say, oh yeah, no, Clayton told me about that one time. Not a big deal. He believed it was true, and that's okay with me. So when you hear the critic, you don't have to worry so much about that. You're like, yeah, okay, I was told that. But in general, if you're like, who wrote Genesis? Moses. Good answer. Okay. Context. When was the book written? Well, let me tell you, this is a simple timeline that if you're like, I can't keep track of all the dates and things in the Bible, this is a really helpful way to kind of get your bearings on how it happens. These 5 most significant events from the beginning of the story of Israel to Jesus are all spaced out about 500 years, give or take. I mean, you'll be in the ballpark, okay? So Jesus is, 33 AD. You go back 500 years before that is the exile. I won't bother to explain what that is in this context. 500 years before that is King David. 500 years before that is Moses. And 500 years before that is Abraham, okay? So it's just a simple timeline to help you get your bearings. But here's the thing. This is when the events of the book of Genesis happen. This is when the writing of the book of Genesis happens. Now, this is really, really important because knowing when it was written helps you understand the purpose of the book. Because if you think, you know what this is? This is just so I know information about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you might miss why Moses feels like it's important to write a book about this. Like, Moses was a really busy guy, right? Like, he was the leader of a country, and he was going up and meeting with God and establishing laws, and he was busy confronting Pharaoh and fighting battles and doing all sorts of stuff. And he said, I got time to write 5 books. And one of them is a story about a bunch of these guys. Why do I want people to know about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the creation of the world and all of this stuff? Moses had just led the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. Now, I want you to put yourself in the mind of a freed slave. For generation upon generation, hundreds of years, your family line, you've been slaves in a foreign land. When you get set free, your question is, what do I do now? It's not like they were captured for a little while and they just go back to their old life. They had no old life. It was wiped out. Their cultural identity, their sense of who we are as a people was crushed by the fact that they were dominated by these Egyptian taskmasters. So as they come out of that, Moses says, I want to tell you the story of your family. So this is the purpose of the book. Genesis was written to show God's people their identity, who they are. You've been told you are slaves and you must obey Pharaoh, but I want to tell you who you are. You are not slaves. And their purpose, why they're here. Are you here to build these cities for Pharaoh? Are you here to do their will? No, you've got a bigger purpose than that. But how do you find out your identity and your purpose? By telling the story of their origin. Where did they actually come from? This is an incredibly important story to tell. Because otherwise, the people of Israel, they're wandering blind. They don't know where they came from. So that's the purpose. And this is going to be important. We're going to come back around to this at the very end because this purpose is going to be relevant for us too. We're not freed Israelites, but this purpose applies to us as well. Let me give you an outline of the book, okay? First 11 chapters of the book are what we call primeval history. It just means stuff a really long time ago. That's kind of the technical term that you'll see in books or whatever. The stories that most of us are familiar with when we immediately think of Genesis happen in that section. So that is the creation, the fall, Noah and the flood. Okay, so that all happens in there. We're going to unpack a little bit of why that's there in a bit. But after covering lots and lots of time, from the creation of the world through generation after generation of people, primeval history covers 11 chapters. It zeroes in on one single family, Abraham's family. Okay? The rest of the book, chapters 12 through 50, go through 4 generations of this family and tells you the ups and downs of their experience. Okay? If someone asks you, after you take this class, what is the book of Genesis about? If you say creation and fall, that's right. But I would hope you would also say this. It's about Abraham's family. So if you remember like 3 things, what's it about? Creation, fall, and Abraham's family. That will get you started. All right, let's start at the beginning. Creation. Now, when we talk about creation, most of the time, as modern people, the question that we ask is, how did God do this? It's a very relevant question to us. We think about science, we think about process, we're interested in those sorts of things, and so we say, how did God do this? And so we get into conversations about, do we take the days of Genesis literally, and how does that fit with the accounts of scientific, discoveries and things like that? How do they fit together, and what do we think about all of this stuff? And these are important questions. But no one who was at the original audience of this book asked those questions. They weren't thinking about them, and Moses wasn't trying to answer them. So while they are important for us to discuss, if we get bogged down in those, we miss the main point that Moses was trying to communicate, the main point that the reason this book is here, okay? And the reason the opening chapters of the book are here is to describe this idea of shalom. Shalom, simple definition is this: the way things are meant to be. The way things are meant to be. It is when everything, all the different aspects of the world are woven together, they're in their right place, they're working the way they're supposed to, and things are flourishing. It is good that it is this way. So when you read the beginning of the Bible, the words that get repeated again and again and again and again are this: God saw it and it was good. It was good. It was good. And so as you read the first 2 chapters, you're supposed to say, what does good actually look like? Because most of us, we've never really seen good, unadulterated, pure good. Little glimpses here and there, but not like this. And so this is the way I sum this up. If you've been around at Grace Community this summer, you heard me do this a bunch of times, but it's good for you to hear it again. So here's what shalom is. Starts off at the beginning with God's presence. God's presence. In the beginning, God, and God is hovering over the face of the deep. And so you've got God always there. And what God is doing is saying, I'm going to make a space where people can be with me. That's the point at the beginning, is I'm going to make a space where my creation can come into relationship with me. And so God's presence is at the heart of shalom. So God makes a place. When God creates the world and then God creates the Garden of Eden, He is making a space, a place where his presence can dwell and he can be with his people. Third aspect of shalom, God's people. So God creates humanity. We're going to talk about the purpose of humanity in just a minute. And he, at the beginning, creates Adam and Eve. And he says, I want to be with you. I love the idea. I got this out of a children's Bible, but it's an evocative image of God creating Adam and breathing the breath of life into him. And so when Adam opens his eyes as a human being for the first time, what's he doing? He's looking into the face of God. What a beautiful, beautiful thing. That's shalom, God's people and God's place and God's presence, but not just to enjoy that, but to do something. God has a purpose for humanity. God says, you have an assignment. I'm going to send you out to do something. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And it's all held together by this. This is a little different from what we did in the summer sermon series. So if you're like, hey, we're getting bonus content. Yes, I thought of something new. After we did the whole thing, I was like, I should have started with this. God's image, okay? So the purpose of God, the people of God, the presence of God, the place of God, the linchpin of it all, for the system of shalom to work, God says, I am going to create people in my image. And the fact that people are created in God's image is what keeps the whole thing together. Now, we are going to look at the passage where it talks about God's image here. I'm going to put it on the screen, but if you've got a Bible, go ahead and open up to Genesis chapter 1. And as I read this, I want you to note what this means for yourself. If you're on your own, you can jot this down, write it down. If in the room, after I read this, we're going to discuss this at the table, and you can throw it in chat. But the question is this: according to this passage, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? Okay, so think about this as we read. Genesis 1, verses 26 through 28. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. All right, discuss at your table, jot down if you're at home, discuss with someone that you're sitting with. What does it mean to be made in God's image? And as you think about that, you can go ahead and throw that into the chat. All right, I'm going to give you about 30 more seconds. All right. Go ahead and wrap up whatever final comments you're making. Throw something in the chat if you want to share it. Being made in the image of God. Let me just hear one or two thoughts from in the room, and I'll read some of these comments as they're coming in. What does it mean to be made in God's image?
Well, you have authority.
Have authority. So it talks about authority in the passage. Yeah. Creating. So God created. In His image we would create. Probably not in the exact same way. We can't speak and make it happen, but making things. All right, well, what does rule mean? All right, we'll get to that. That's a good question. A couple of things that are on here. To take care of His world, share in His attributes, so that we could know Him, have a relationship with Him, reflect what He is like. Let's see, I wrote down a few that are already passed here. To be stewards, to be made in His character, all these different things. Okay, so as you look at the passage, different people over the course of history have kind of identified different things that they've latched onto and said, I think this might be the aspect that makes us in God's image. So one is the kind of relational side of things. A number of people have picked up on that, where it's let us create in our image. So there's a sense of community that's there, and then God creates male and female, not just one, but more than one, and says be fruitful and multiply. So there must be this sense of community and relationship with God and with others. So some people say maybe being relational is what it means to be made in the image of God. There's also simply the idea of, well, what's something in an image or likeness? It looks like them. So what is God like? His character. There are certain things in His character that we say we can have those too, in ways that other creatures don't. We say, we're like Him. And so people have speculated, what particular things about God do we reflect? And there's a whole big long list that people will try. And then there's the aspect that was highlighted here, and a number of people here, that we rule. So there's this task that's given to people, that we are supposed to go out and have authority to rule, to exercise dominion over the world. Okay, so I think that all of these are angled in the right way. I do think that task of ruling is sort of the linchpin aspect of it, okay? So the reason is, can you think of other relational creatures that are not made in the image of God? Angels, right? Right? Angels can relate to people. They can interact. They're not like, the gerbil or whatever. They can actually engage, right? Can you think of other creatures that reflect some character of God? Yeah, well, someone's putting up the horns, like demons also, just a fallen form of angel. And there are other, like if you say God is intelligent and we're intelligent, well, angels are intelligent too. Spiritual. Any other spiritual beings? Angels and demons. So you end up with this category. You say, what is distinct about humanity? Some of these things are definitely reflections of the image of God. But the thing that makes it distinct is there is one creature that has been assigned to be a ruler in the world, where we are supposed to actually be in charge of things. So in the ancient world, kings would set up images of themselves in lands where they ruled, where they couldn't physically be. And the idea was, if you see this image here, you know who's in charge here. They represent me. Similarly, kings themselves were said to be images of the gods. So if you're in Egypt, literally the Pharaoh was considered to be a literal god. In Mesopotamia and Babylon and these sorts of areas, they were considered representatives of the gods. But that's only if you were a king. Because you're supposed to say, this country is supposed to be ruled under the divine hand, and I represent the divine, right? So it feels very good to be made in the image of God that way. But what the Hebrew Bible does, it says that all people are made in the image of God, which means every single person has responsibility to rule over some aspect of God's world. That's kind of what God was doing when He put Adam and Eve in the garden. He's saying, here's your turf. This is your kingdom. This is where you start to exercise dominion. Now, there's a couple of questions that are embedded in there, so we don't get this wrong. First is this. When we think of ruling, we think of, you know the verse where Jesus says, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, right? It's the idea of like, we think of this as you exercise your will on things and your will is law. Like we have this kind of picture of rule like that. That's not what's being talked about here. What's being talked about here is a sense of good leadership, like the kind of leadership that you don't necessarily think of, they're ruling over me, but you feel the good effect when you have a leader who is drawing out the potential that you have. Like good leaders, you can tell by looking at the people around them, and those people are flourishing. They're more effective, they're more powerful, they're more of who they were supposed to be because that leader is drawing that out of them. That's what we're supposed to do for the world. So God sends humanity out into the world and says, bring out all the potential in it. Lead it into something more than it is. So this is the second thing that's kind of the question there. What's to rule if everything's perfect, right? You just kind of press play, it's on autopilot, like don't touch it because it'll mess it up, right? Like if it's already perfect, any change would be away from perfection. Wrong way to think about it, okay? There was nothing wrong in the world, but that doesn't mean the world was finished. So there's a weird shift for us. Once you realize it, you're like, oh, that totally makes sense. How was the world made? Did it have paintings? Did it have automobiles? Did it have hammers? Did it have pyramids? Did it have anything other than untamed nature? Did it even have gardens? Well, only one, right? Because God kind of got it started. But what are Adam and Eve supposed to do in the garden? Tend it and keep it. They're supposed to make something out of it, which means they're going in there, they're planting things, they're watering things, they're tending to plants, they're doing all sorts of stuff. They got work to do, right? To draw the potential out of the world. I imagine that they're looking at these plants and saying, I wonder if we could find a sweeter one, and they're kind of thinking about hybrid, plants and things, and, they're like looking at this and saying, what can we do with this? I wonder if we can make a recipe out of this. What if we mix this and that and we had something? That is rule. It's drawing the potential out of the world and making something out of it. So this is what it means to be made in the image of God. Being sent out into the world to make something of it the way God would. Okay, so we represent God. We say, what would God do in this situation to draw creatively out of this something new and different and more? And that's what we were made to do. We go out and do that. So when you go into your workplace, when you engage with your family, when you write something or draw something or play something musically, what are you doing? Like God, you are drawing out more goodness in the world. This is what shalom is. Now, shalom lasts about 2 chapters, so I wish I could hang out here a little bit more, but we got to tell the tale, right? So, here's what happens in chapter 3. After sin enters the world, I won't do a full recap of that one, but serpent comes, tempts Adam and Eve, they fall for it, okay? This is what God declares over that, and it's a curse, and it's really important for understanding the rest of the book of Genesis to see what the problem is that the rest of the book has to deal with, all right? So let's read this. Genesis 3, starting in verse 16, says, "So the Lord God said to the serpent, 'Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly and you will eat dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head and you will strike his heel.'" Now we're going to keep going in this, but I want to pause here for a second. It's important for us to remember that we live in a world that's under a curse. One of my favorite series of books is the Chronicles of Narnia. You read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Some children find their way into the land of Narnia, and it's this beautiful, beautiful winter scene, right? They're walking to the snowy woods, and it looks really amazing until they meet someone and find out that in this land, it is always winter, but never Christmas. It's a land that has been placed under a curse. That at first glance, you might be deceived into thinking that this was a beautiful, well-put-together place, but after a while, you realize there's something achingly wrong here. It's always longing for something more, and it is broken that way. we live in a world that has been cursed. When you feel the wrongness of things in the world, there's a reason for that. It is broken. Now, the really interesting thing about God's curse is at the very beginning, he tells us how the curse is going to end. It's really gracious of God to do this. He goes directly to the enemy and says, because you've done this, because you have taken out the king and queen of creation, you have gone to them and said, hey, listen to me instead of to God. This is what's going to happen to you. You've ruined shalom, and so one of the offspring of the woman will crush your head, but you will bruise his heel. Now, this is a really mysterious thing. Like if you were in Moses' time and you were reading this, there would be a whole lot of question marks. Say, what does that mean? Now, along the way, there are characters that step towards this, where they crush evil and they're wounded for it. But there's always something out there saying, this isn't definitive, this isn't done. So it's always pointing out beyond itself, looking for the promised child who would deliver us from evil. Now, that idea of a promised child, in fact, the word here, offspring, is the word seed. So you'll see this in some translations of the Bible. Your seed, your offspring, comes up again and again in the story of Genesis and the story of the Bible, waiting for the definitive one that's going to come. But along the way, there's a number of promised children. To the woman, God said this, I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With pain you will labor and give birth to children. With painful labor you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. To Adam he said, because you have listened to your wife and ate from the fruit of the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life. So in the woman, God pronounces a two-sided curse here. Talks about pains in childbearing. Now I want to clarify this a little bit because this is normally, I don't like to be the guy that's like, well, let me tell you what the Hebrew really says. But this is one where I think that they got it wrong in a way that is really unhelpful, okay? I hear childbearing is painful, but this verse is not particularly about delivery. The words in Hebrew in other places are not translated pain or childbirth. They are anxiety and conception. You will have anxiety over conception. The first half of that phrase says you're going to be nervous whether or not you're going to be able to get pregnant. And you will wonder, will I ever have children? Have you ever met a woman who was anxious about whether or not she would ever get to be a mom? Well, if you read the book of Genesis, you're going to meet a lot of them. There are a whole, I always pause here when I teach this because it's really important. There are a whole lot of women and men who are married to women who haven't been able to conceive, and they wonder, does God actually see me or understand this? It turns out from the very beginning, God knew exactly what was going on with that. And as we go through the book of Genesis, you're going to see he actually addresses this again and again and again and again. This is part of the curse. This is part of the curse. Then the other side, your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Again, as we read through the book of Genesis, the relationship of marriage is busted and messed up. There are so many places where husbands dominate over their wives in an abusive way, even the people who we consider the good guys. And there are so many women who manipulate their husbands to get what they want. It's an adversarial relationship that gets set up here. Instead of shalom, instead of God's people being in harmony with each other, in the closest of relationships where there's supposed to be partnership in God's purposes and no shame, there's conflict. Adam, cursed is the ground because of you. This is generally about work, but it's also very particularly about the ground. As we read through the book of Genesis, the number of times there are famines where people can't get food, where that's a driving plot point in a story, is a lot. So as you go along, the women can't have kids, and the men can't find food for their family. Over and over and over again. Those are what the stories, the elements that are in there. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat of the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and dust you will return. And of course, this is the ultimate curse, right? Death. We are made from dust, and to dust we will return. And as we go through the book of Genesis again, each generation dies Each generation dies over and over and over again. Even some of the really curious parts, okay? I'm not going to unpack all of this, but when you read these genealogies and these people live for like super long periods of time, you know what you're supposed to do with that is not like, okay, let me calculate it all out. No, you're supposed to look at that and say, you know what, the numbers are getting smaller. What that's supposed to tell you is two things. One, God keeps giving us new people because a generation comes and a generation comes, and even though there is death, life keeps on happening. But at the same time, death creeps in more and more and more and more, and death seems to be winning. And it's this race that people are just barely keeping out of death's reach. A new generation comes, but the old one gets taken away. So this is the struggle of Genesis. What do you do when the curse of death is chasing you? So this is what happens to Shalom. People made in God's image abandon God's character. They say, we don't want to reflect what God's like. We're going to do what we want. And so instead of ruling over the world and making something good out of it, they say, we're going to make whatever we want out of God's world. And so God's people are divided from each other, and they go into conflict with each other. The very first story after the fall is two brothers, and one kills the other out of rivalry, envy. They get kicked out of God's place, taken out of the Garden of Eden, and therefore they no longer have access to God's direct presence. Yeah, he is present everywhere, but walking with God, experiencing fellowship with him, they're cut off from that. And so Shalom is shattered. Now, the story of the fall happens in Genesis chapter 3, but I talked about that primeval history, that kind of first 11 chapters. It's actually really helpful to see what happens in the following chapters, because over the course of Genesis chapter 3 through 11, you see what the fall does. It kind of unravels into this big spiraling crash. So to get at this, I'm going to show you one of my favorite resources, Bible Project videos. If you haven't seen them, now you will. And they're amazing. You should watch them. But this is a good explanation of the first 11 chapters of Genesis.
The first book in the Bible is a book you've probably heard of. It's called Genesis.
Genesis comes from a Hebrew word. It's pronounced reshit, and it just means beginning.
Now, there's a lot of stories from the book of Genesis, and it's easy just to pull out a specific story and try to tell you what it might mean. But we think the best way to understand this book is to look at the book as a whole and show you how the whole thing is designed.
The book is designed to fall into two main parts. You have chapters 1 through 11, which is telling the story of God and the whole world. And then you have the second part, which is about God and Abraham's family, as chapters 12 through 50. And how the two of those parts relate, that's where you find the message of the book.
Okay, so let's start back at the beginning. The first part of Genesis begins with a creation story where God creates everything.
And how exactly that happens, of course, that's where all the debates come. But he takes a dark, watery chaos and he turns it into a beautiful garden where humans can flourish.
That sounds nice.
It does sound nice. In fact, 7 different times God says of all that he's made that it's good.
And this is where we meet the first human characters in the Bible, Adam and Eve.
They're both individual characters, but they're also representative. Adam is the Hebrew word for humanity, and Eve is the Hebrew word for life. And God creates them in his image. In other words, humanity reflects, or is meant to reflect, the creativity, the goodness, and character of the Creator out into the world that he's made. And they're supposed to reproduce and make cultures and neighborhoods and art and gardens and everything else. But he gives them a moral
choice about how they're going to go about building this world. And this is what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is all about.
And he tells them, don't eat of the fruit of this tree or you will die. What's that all about?
So up till now, God has been the one defining and providing what is good. And so God is the one with the knowledge of good and evil. But now this tree represents a choice. Will the humans trust God's definition of good and evil, or are they going to seize the opportunity and define good and evil for themselves?
And Adam and Eve eat the fruit.
This is the core biblical explanation for that concept of sin, that desire to call the shots myself. It's the inward turn of the human heart to do what's good for me and my tribe, even if it's at the expense of you and your tribe.
And the problem is humans are horrible at defining good and evil without God. And so now that humanity's made this choice, things get really
really bad. So Genesis 3 through 11 is like tracing this downward spiral of all humanity. So Adam and Eve, they can't trust each other anymore. And so there's a little story about how they were naked and felt fine about it beforehand, but now they feel shameful because all of a sudden Adam's definition of good and evil might be different than Eve's, and so they hide from each other.
Then there's another story of temptation. Cain is jealous of his brother Abel, and he gives in and kills him.
There's a story right after Cain about a guy named Lamech, and all we know about Lamech is that he accumulates wives like property, and he sings songs about how he's a more violent, vengeful person than Cain ever was, and he's proud of it.
Things get so bad with the human race that we see God decide to just wipe us out.
Yeah, we typically think of the flood story as about God being angry, but it actually begins with God's sadness and grief about the state of his world. And so out of his passion to preserve the goodness of his world, he washes it clean with the flood.
But there's a glimmer of hope. He chooses Noah and his whole family, and he saves them on this boat.
Yeah, don't forget about the animals.
Right, and the animals. So Noah and his family are going to reboot all of humanity. I mean, he must be a pretty great guy.
But this is the story most people don't know because it's kind of weird, is that Noah gets off the boat and he plants a vineyard and he gets totally plastered, and then something sketchy happens in his tent with his son. It's a tragic story.
So from here, humanity grows again, but things are as bad as before. And the last story is the famous story of the Tower of Babel.
And in this story, you have all of the nations uniting together to use this new technology they have, the brick. And they want to make a name for themselves and build this big city with a huge tower that will reach up to the gods. But God knows that this city will be a nightmare. And so in his mercy, he scatters them. And all of these stories, they're underlining the same basic idea. When humans seize autonomy from God, when they define good and evil for themselves, it results in a world of tragedy and death.
And this leaves you wondering, is there any hope for humanity?
Yes, yeah, there is. It's the very next story that answers that question. It's the beginning of God's mission to rescue and restore his world.
So here's what happens. Things spiral out of control. We end up in Babel, not just a person, not just a family, but an entire civilization set to elevate humanity and to thumb their nose in the face of God. And this is what we've got, Babel. This is what the world has become. The imagers of God have created something out of the world, but it is not good. It is not good. And so God's going to do something. And here's the question. How do we get back to Eden? How do we get shalom back? What's God going to do? And here's the answer. Covenants. Covenants. Okay, this is something we don't talk about very much, but covenants are God's primary tool for putting shalom back together. Covenants are God's primary tool. As you read through the Bible, you encounter covenants, and those are the tools when God is saying, I'm bringing it back together. So this is the question you should be asking when you see one of these. But of course, you got to wonder, what is a covenant, right? Okay, this is what we're going to explain, but I'm going to have to take a little detour to explain what a covenant really is, and I'm going to have to talk about family, all right? So in the chat and around your table, go ahead and answer this. How many people live in your home, and how many generations live in your home? Okay? How many people live in your home, and how many generations live in your home? I love that in the chat it says, do dogs count? If they count to you. All right. So here are the answers we see coming in on the chat. We've got a lot of 2 people, 3 people in one generation. We've got at least one person who's a 7-person, 2 generations. 6 people, 3 generations. But most of them, 3 and 2. 3 people, 4 people, 2 generations. And someone asked if dogs count, and so I don't know if that adds a generation. This is what the modern nuclear family looks like. Okay, so not everybody fits this mold, but when most people kind of stereotypically imagine a family, this is what Americans imagine: a husband and a wife, or at least a partner's, some children, maybe 2 or 3, right? Maybe a dog, and for some people, an in-law, right? Like, this is about as complicated as it gets for most families. Let me describe to you, if I said family to anybody in the ancient world, for most people prior to the Industrial Revolution, but certainly in the ancient Near East, this is what they would have thought of. A patriarch, okay, this is important, not just husband, not just father, patriarch, with his wife and his sons and daughters. But also, if he had adult sons, their wives, and their children. And also, any of those who are adults and their children. And his other wives and their kids. Now that's getting weird, right? And any hired workers they had working for the family, any slaves they had, and any sojourners, which are people who are traveling through the area, and they didn't just travel on vacation, they were headed someplace, or they were looking for something better, and so they didn't have land to live on, so they would stay with people. So if you said home or family to someone in the ancient Near East, they would picture this crowd of people. Now, this is very familiar to me. Some of you know that I grew up in a foster family, which means that in my home, if I got to answer this question, I would say 4 generations, somewhere north of 12 or 15 people in my home at any given time, plus the dog and a bunch of strangers that lived in this. So I'm like, this is my kind of family. I understand what this is going on. So we had a crazy family, but most people don't think of this. And even within our family, it didn't really work like this. The key thing here is the patriarch. Not that my dad didn't want to be the patriarch. Okay, he's in the room. He's like, what are you talking about? But this is the idea in the ancient world. Families were organized around the oldest living male relative, and they were the principle around which the family revolved. That doesn't mean that they were, it was like, do everything for me. It doesn't mean that they were those selfish rulers, although sometimes they were. And we see that in Genesis. But it just means that if you're going to figure out how the family was organized, you started with the oldest living male relative. The ancient culture was like this. You had the father's house, which would be kind of your family household, that what I just described is kind of the center of things. That was kind of your immediate community. A group of father's houses was called a clan, so you see that in the Bible. A group of clans was called a tribe, so in Israel there were 12 tribes. And then all the tribes together were the whole people. So you'll see these terms, and they mean very specific things in the Bible. The people of Israel, or the clan of so-and-so, the tribe of Levi, those sorts of things. They're talking about these groups of things. And when they talk about going to my father's household, they're describing this, okay? The importance of this is that within that family, in ancient times, they didn't have police forces. They didn't have insurance. They didn't have welfare. They didn't have all sorts of things that we think of as kind of the social structure around us in between our families. Their families had to function as all of those things. And so ancient families were what we call patriarchal, which means who is responsible. Okay, sometimes we think of patriarch as who's in charge. It's who is responsible. Like, if something happens in this family, who do you go to? The patriarch, okay? And he said, here's how we're going to approach this thing. So where does the buck stop? It stops with him, because if something goes wrong, he's got to deal with it. It was patrilineal, okay? This word just means who gets to inherit. Like, how do you figure out who takes the family property? Because as that family, you are not thinking, one day I'm going to go off on my own and do something. You're saying this family property is what sustains a whole community of people. Basically, a whole village of people rely on what we have. So who's going to take that into the next generation and inherit what that is so they can take care of the next people? So it goes to the next patriarch. It's also patrilocal, which means everybody lives with their patriarch. So our modern idea of one day I hit 18, and then my parents set this timer that says, how long is it going to be until they're out of here, makes no sense in the ancient world. Because if that happened, Then the family land gets abandoned, or you sell it off and you split it up and all the resources get scattered. This is the problem in the prodigal son, is the younger son says, I'm going to leave. He says, I don't want anything to do with that family. I'm not going to help out with that. And so he runs away from his patriarch. And so this is the way the ancient world thought about that. Now, to us, it seems really weird. I'm sure there are questions you're like, how did that work? And like, was that a good thing or a bad thing? It doesn't matter if it was a good or bad thing. It was the thing. It was just the way it worked. So when people heard the words about family, they imagined this. And so when we see this in the Bible, we've got to imagine that too. So when we read about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their families, we're thinking about this big group. So when it says Abraham traveled with his family to another land, later on, you'll be surprised, it's like 300 people were with him. 300 people and his family? Yeah, because it was this big, extended, massive thing that was going with him. And so you've got to picture that when you're thinking about this. And most of the drama in the stories of Genesis have to do with some aspect of this, some aspect of family politics and how it's going to play out between generations. So that's part of what's going on. So you just got to have that in the back of your head. But here is the really big reason why this is important, because it helps us explain what a covenant is. A covenant is this. It's a promise that turns non-family into family. It's a promise that turns non-family into family. Now, we know this. There are only two covenants that we really talk about these days. One is marriage, and one is adoption. In marriage, what happens? Two people who are not family, hopefully, walk into a room. They make promises to each other. They say, I'm going to do this for you, and it unites them so that when they walk out of that room, they are a family. Adoption, what happens? Children who are not part of the family go into a room, and before a judge, their parents make promises to them and say, I am going to be your parents. I'm going to take the responsibility of that. And when they walk out of that room, when the judge says that's a binding promise, they are family. They are family. And so it takes non-family and turns them into family. Now, for us, we think of that mostly in terms of relational warmth, right? Like now we care for each other, we love each other, right? In the ancient world, it came with a whole lot of other things. It means financially we're bound together. It means that in terms of political engagement in the world, we're bound together. In terms of responsibility for you and your needs, when someone falls on hard times, it is not just, if I can help, my distant relative out there. No, like this is your social safety net, is the father's house, is the patriarchal structure. So if you want to make a deal with someone in society, so let's say you're thinking, I want to go into a business partnership. Well, guess who your business is? Your family, right? Every family is a family business, and every business is a family. So if you want to make a business partnership with someone, you say, well, if we have a partnership, we're going to act like brothers. So what do? You say, in this arena, we will be brothers. And you form a covenant, and you say, now we're going to act like family with each other. We'll partner with each other. If you are a smaller group of people and you need protection from a bigger group of people, you're saying, I need a daddy, right? So you go to the king that's nearby and you say, will you protect me? We will pledge our loyalty to you if you will act like a dad to us and you will protect us. And so they wouldn't think of each other as like, well, like now, we love each other so much. No, it was a deal, right? You will carry out the responsibility of family for me. Because as our king, you have to act like our father and defend us. And so this is what God does with his people. Okay, let me read a quote. This is my favorite book on the Old Testament, The Epic of Eden by Sandra Richter. Buy it, read it multiple times. How might a person go about establishing a relationship of privilege and responsibility with someone who is non-kin, okay, non-family? Most simply answered, that person would have to make kin out of non-kin. On the individual, tribal, and eventually the national level, if you needed someone to act like a family member, and you were willing to give that person the privileges of family in return, you would invite that individual or tribe or nation into a covenant agreement, which created fictional kinship. In this area, we are going to pretend like we're family. And so this is what God does with Abraham. He makes a promise that turns him into family. I'm going to take care of you like a father. And so, we're going to look at the promises to Abraham. As we read this, I want you to list them for yourselves, okay? Just jot down the promises that you see as I read this. The Lord said to Abram, go to your country, your people, and your father's household. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household. Now, you should hear that differently, right? Go from your land and your people and your father's household. He's saying, you are going to be patriarchless. You are going to have to walk away from the only security you have. Cash out the 401k, sell the house, nothing. It's just you on the road. Nobody's looking out for you. No patriarch, no household. But go to the land that I will show you, and I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Go ahead and take a moment. Jot down the promises God makes there. All right, these are the promises God makes, and these are the promises that turn Abraham into his family. 4 things. God is going to give him a great name, okay? So he's leaving the father's household, and he is going to be, he's going to be without kind of a legacy there. So God is going to give him a great name. One of the interesting things about this is what the people of Babel were trying to get. Let's make a name for ourselves, and then turn the page, and God's saying, Abram, I'm going to make a name for you. You don't earn it, you receive it from me. So he's going to give him a great name. Then he's going to make him a great nation. He leaves his family, and God says, I'm going to give you a whole new one. You're going to be a great nation. This is one of the themes that comes up again and again in the book. Actually, the great name theme comes up over and over again. Notice the number of people who get a new name. That's partly just a literary way of pointing to this theme, that God is the one who makes you and your identity and gives you your legacy. Great nation, though. Again and again, the question is, how will Abraham's family become a nation? It's always the question in the back. You've got to keep asking that. If they're going to become a nation, how is it going to happen? Because it looks like it's not going to happen again and again and again. They're going to have a great land. He's leaving his father's country to who knows where, okay? And when we talk about traveling in the ancient world, this is not like, hey, I bought a plane ticket and I ended up someplace else. They're walking places. They're probably not even riding most places. They've got, donkeys and camels and things like that, but those are usually to carry stuff, okay? So it takes a long time to travel places. But they're going to go someplace they have not been, to another land, and God says, I'm going to give it to you. How? How's that going to happen? You're going to be a great blessing to all nations of the earth. And this is really the end goal, right? So this is where God says, because you guys are going to be the ones to bring shalom. You guys are going to be the ones to bring shalom. Abraham, your family is going to bring shalom. Now, the nations come up all the time in the book of Genesis. They're interacting with the Egyptians. They're interacting with the nations that live in the land of Canaan. And you'll even notice this when you realize that some of the people that they talk about, a guy named Esau, the children of Lot, and so on, Ishmael, it talks about them as if you're supposed to know who they are, because all of those people, their descendants, also become nations. So later on in the book of in the Bible, the children of Abraham, who become the nation of Israel, are interacting with the children of Esau, which is the nation of Edom. Or the children of Lot become Ammon and Moab. And these other nations that just kind of go by you when you're reading the rest of the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, their patriarchs, their originators, are there. And so all the interactions between Israel and their neighboring nations start to happen in these kind of interpersonal relationships in Genesis. So you see this as you go there. This is how God's going to bring shalom back, by turning Abraham's family into the anti-Babel kingdom. He's saying, what Babel is, you're going to be the opposite. Instead of relying on yourself, making something for yourself, your family is going to show the world there is a different way to be a kingdom, a different kind of nation. And by doing that, it will bring shalom back to the world. Okay. The story of Genesis is the story of what happens with this covenant as it gets passed down from Abraham to his children, to their children, and so on. And so when you get to the people of Israel, so remember, Moses has set the people of Israel free, and they're saying, who are we? He's telling this story. This is how it got passed down from generation to generation. This is a family promise that you have inherited. Let me tell you about your family and our legacy and what your purpose is, because it's big. You're bringing shalom back. So when they're standing at the foot of the mountain and Israel's like, who are we supposed to be? This tells you, you're stitching the world back together. You guys are the rescue plan that God has put into place. Okay, here's what we're going to do. We are going to take a 10-minute break. Those of you online, we will be back in 10 minutes, but you can put in questions in the chat while we're during that break, so I can come back, and if there are things that we need to clarify or things you want explored a little bit, you can put those in there, and I'll try to address some of those before we jump in to how to do the comma method. All right? Go ahead and take a 10-minute break.
go with me to my Father's house. Come and go with me to my Father's house. It's a big, big house with lots and lots of room. A big, big table with lots and lots of food. A big, big yard where we can play football. A big, big house. It's my Father's house. A big, big house with lots and lots of room. A big, big table with lots and lots of food. A big, big yard where we can play football. A big, big house. It's my Father's house.
All right, we're going to get started in like about 30 seconds here. All right, here we go. Go ahead, if you're in the room, have a seat. Going to address a couple of the questions. I can't answer every question that's out there, but I can address a couple of them on here. One question here, Lisa asks, what happens if a covenant is broken? That's a really good question because as we go into the story of the Bible, the rest of the Bible, it shows that one side of the covenants that God makes tends to not keep their promises, okay? So there's an analogy that comes up a lot later in the Bible, which is the analogy of God being married to his people. And we think that's a little weird because it's like, is this a romance? Like you kind of like, okay, what do we do with that? The point of that analogy is there were promises made, and the analogy gets used to say God's wife keeps cheating on him. And so the underlying tension of most of the Old Testament is, what is God going to do about the fact that his wife keeps cheating on him? Is he going to divorce her, or is he going to keep his promise in spite of the fact that she has broken the covenant? So I kind of don't want to answer the question. I want to say, go read the rest of the Bible, because it's digging in. What does God feel when that happens? You know, there are places where God says to his people in the book of Jeremiah, I was like a father to you, and you ran away from me. Or I was like a husband to you. What fault did you find in me that you would go and cheat on me with those other gods? And so there is definitely in the heart of God a wrestling with how do I keep loving people who won't love me? And the way that it gets answered is Jesus. So we're going to talk more about that, actually, because we're going to talk about some of the covenant stuff here in a minute. In terms of, someone asked, where can I find out more about the patriarchal family? And that book that I recommended, The Epic of Eden, has a whole chapter about that that's really good. So I basically ripped off Dr. Richter. She kind of did a presentation about that. I was like, I need to teach that in church. So credit where credit is due. I learned a lot from her from that, so I'd recommend that. But some of the relevance of the question had to do with, what do we do about messy family situations now? That's beyond the scope of here, but that is one of those places where if you want to talk to someone in our care ministry or care night, there are lots of ways we can help you in situations where it's messy with family stuff. So I can't unpack that all here, but it's really, really important. Let's see. There was another question about, what about the Nephilim? Okay, if you've ever read Genesis 6, right before God sends the flood, there's this thing about the sons of God sleeping with the daughters of man, and they have offspring that are called the Nephilim. Forever, people have been debating this. There are two major views. One is the view that the sons of God are divine beings. So some rebellious angels show up and they sleep with some women and they have weird offspring. There's a lot about that that's very strange. That was the main view in ancient times. I bet you if you walked up to one of the apostles or one of the disciples that was hanging out with Jesus, that's probably how they would explain that. That's how most people in the first century did. The other view is that is the sons of God is sort of like, you know how I said that kings would say they were made in the image of God? It's sort of like these rulers in the area saying, we are divine, and they are taking women from their kingdom and sleeping with them, and their children end up being, these great warriors or whatever. Those views have gone back and forth throughout history. Again, early on, kind of first century Jews would have said the first option, but later on, Jews and Christians both kind of favored the other option, mostly because this option is very weird. there is a passage, I'm totally diverting on this, my goodness. There's a passage in the book of Peter that talks about this, and it sure seems like he's talking about some sort of weird divine beings, but it's one of those places where you say, I don't know what to do with that, and that's okay. When you get to places in the Bible where you're like, I can't figure this out, it's probably like the main things are really clear. And there's a whole lot of things that we will ponder and maybe never come to a full understanding on, and that is okay. The Bible's not a book you're supposed to figure out. It's a book you're supposed to live with and live in, and it shapes you as you do that. And sometimes you ponder those weird things, and eventually you get to someplace that's insightful. Other times, it's just the way that God says, I know more things than you, okay? And I always thank God, I'm glad you know more than I do. I don't understand this. Thank you, God. There were a few other things here. We'll maybe come back to those. I want to dig into a passage here, okay? Here's what we're going to do. We are going to do the comma method. I already talked a bit about context here, giving you a big overview of the themes of the book. Now we're going to talk about observation. This is the part where you actually look at the passage and say, what is actually there? But we're going to talk about how to observe when you are reading a narrative, okay? So a story that you are reading. Because stories end up having lots and lots of details. And sometimes it's easy to get hung up on a lot of little kind of incidental things and miss the main point. So it's important to learn how to look for the main points so you get the big idea before you go kind of getting distracted by the smaller things. Not that those are unimportant, but if you don't get the main thing, you'll make the wrong thing the main thing. Got it? So here's how we observe when we're talking about a story. We look at the plot. And every plot, kind of the events and how they're organized, has 4 parts, okay? And identifying these 4 parts is really, really helpful when you're observing. First is this, the conflict in the story. The conflict in the story. What is the problem that gets the story going? Okay? This is the only reason you continue with a story, because somewhere early on, something is wrong that needs to be addressed. So every story, I mean, the 3 pigs, right? Like there's a wolf at the door, and he wants to eat the pigs. What is going to happen? How is this going to be resolved? So there's a tension that has to be figured out, okay? Every story, you're saying, what's the conflict? What's the tension? If you can do that for most biblical stories, it will help you realize the point by the time you get to the end. Because you'll say, what problem is it addressing? That will point you towards the answer later. The complication. These are all the twists and turns along the way. The complication is once there's a problem, oftentimes people try to solve the problem and it doesn't work, or a new problem gets introduced, or something distracts them, or whatever. There's all these twists and turns along the way before they solve the problem. Now, the way you know that you're in the complication and you're not at the end is that you still feel like the conflict is there. The original thing that started the problem doesn't get resolved, even though something happens, you're like, oh, is this the point? Is this the point? If you still feel like that original conflict is happening, you haven't reached the point. You are still in all the complications, okay? You're following the thread until it reaches the climax. And this is probably the most important aspect of the story to identify when you're reading, okay? So you got a problem, twists and turns along the way, but then there is a big turning point. There is something that addresses the original problem and changes it. Now, sometimes it changes for the better. The problem gets resolved in some way. Sometimes it changes it for the worse. This did not go well, okay? It didn't actually fix the problem. We got the bad consequences. But it addresses the conflict in some way. And you got to ask the question, how does this correspond with the conflict? So you put those 2 things together. And then, at the end, you get the results, the consequences. Say, as a result of this big turning point, what came about from that? And usually the value of looking at this is to say, did good or bad things come out of this? Because that often will tell you how you're supposed to feel about the conflict and how it climaxed and resolved, okay? You look at this and say, that turning point action didn't go so well. So maybe that wasn't a good thing. Or I thought that was going to be good, but the consequences were bad. Or you look at that and it helps you understand kind of the tone of the story. All right, this is all very much in the abstract. Let's do an example here. This is Genesis chapter 15. This is one of the chapters where God is establishing the covenant with Abraham. And we're going to see if we can identify. I'll use this as an example, and I'll help you identify the conflict, the complication, the climax, and the consequences, okay? And as you go along, feel free to jot those down, what you think they are, all right? After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Okay, keep thinking patriarch, right? He's a patriarch that's got no sons to give to. So his stuff is going to go someplace else. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land and to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abraham brought all these things to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he didn't cut in half. Then the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. I think I copied and pasted the wrong last verse. Oh, we got parasites and stuff in there. We're not supposed to get to the parasites yet. We'll get there. Okay. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and the darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, To your descendants I will give this land from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, Hittites, and all those ites that I skipped before, copied and pasted in the wrong place. There we go. Okay, so this is the story. You're like, that was weird, right? So you read that sometime in a couple of weeks when we get to this passage in Bible Savvy, and you're like, gee whiz, what do I do with this? Okay, you zero in and you say, what was the conflict? What were the complications? What was the climax, and what were the consequences? Okay, so in this story, what is the conflict? What's the problem that gets it going? Here's how I identified the problem. Abram, that was Abram's name before he was called Abraham. Abram is given this promise by God, and that sounds really good, but the promise is that you will have a son, and there'll be a great nation, and they'll have all of these children, and he's like, I don't even have one. Someone else is going to take all my stuff, and all the family that I have right now, it's all just going to go away. I'm going to be a patriarch without a family, and it's gone after this generation. That promise is impossible to keep. Now, at this point, if you've also been reading in the context, you realize Abram and his wife are really old. So they can't, it's not even like, well, okay, you're young, you still got time. It's like, no, this isn't happening. And so he's looking at this and saying, God, you have just created a problem for me. You have just told me something that is not possible. So that's the problem that gets the whole story going. Say, okay, what are we going to do about this problem? How is he going to have children? Complications. Okay, complications is that God keeps doubling down on the promise. Like he's like, I'm going to make you a great nation. Abram's like, not possible, God. Like, I know how this works. Can't happen. God says, go outside. Look at the stars. So shall your offspring be. Now, at this point, we have a little bit of glimmer of hope. Like Abram, he's like, maybe he means it, right? So there's something there. And you think, is this the climax of the story? But then God says, and I'm going to give you land. And he's like, I've been wandering around for decades, and I don't own a single piece of property. So it's like, okay, the problem still isn't solved, right? And he says, no, but I'm going to set your children free, but they're also going to be slaves. They're going to make the problem worse. So you see the twists and turns that are happening, right? So the problem, like you're like, God's making promises that aren't possible to keep. I don't have any kids. I don't have any land. Then they're going to be slaves. Twists and turns and twists and turns and twists and turns. And then this weird thing happens, right? It's got these animals, and they cut them in half, and he's chasing off the birds. It's like, why do you have carcasses lying around? You're having a conversation with God. What is going on? And this is where we start to get to the climax of the story. The part that is the turning point is this. It's when, let me go back here. See in verse 17? When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. Now, if you're looking at this and like, that means nothing to me, my recommendation is to go buy a study Bible. Okay, these are the sorts of things that study Bibles are really helpful. Go get an NIV study Bible. There are a number of other great study Bibles as well, because these are the kinds of things you say, means go look in the footnotes. In the footnotes, it will usually give you an idea of this. So some of you may have study Bibles. You can check that out, but I'll be your study Bible for now if you don't. In the ancient world, one of the ways to make a covenant was to do this, was to say, all right, I am going to cut an animal in half, and when we make the promise, I am going to walk through the animal and symbolically say, if I break the promise, this is what should happen to me. Basically, let the gods curse me, or in this case, God curse me. May I be split in two. May I be killed if I break this promise. So it's a binding oath that they're going to do this. Now, the really interesting thing about this is normally, if I'm making a promise to you and you're making a promise to me, we both walk through it, right? Like if I break the promise, kill me. If you break the promise, kill you, right? Who walks through this? Abram falls asleep, and God, this smoking pot and blazing torch, walks through the pieces that have been divided. And so what God is saying is here, okay, Abram, I just made impossible promises. Promises that you cannot imagine how they would happen. Humanly speaking, you cannot conceive of a way to do this. Literally, you cannot conceive. And you cannot see how this is ever going to possibly happen. But here's how certain I am. If I don't keep this promise, kill me. Now at that point, Abram's thinking, okay, hang on a second. This promise can't be broken. This is a promise that God is going to keep. How is this going to happen? God is staking his life and his reputation on whether or not this is going to happen. So it's as sure as done. The appropriate response to that is to trust and to believe. Which is what the story of Abraham wrestles with. How, is he going to continue to trust and believe in this promise? But when you're reading the story, saying, what is this all about? Do I get hung up about the Perizzites and the Kenizzites and do I get all wigged out by the animals? And what am I supposed to do about this? If you identify the conflict, promises that can't be kept, and the climax, God says, I stake my life on it that I'll keep these, then you know the main idea of the story is God keeps his promises, right? So you observe the conflict and the climax, and you can usually figure out the main idea of the story. Let's practice this together, okay? Open up your Bibles to Genesis chapter 22. Here we go. And I want you to do this. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes in just on your own. I'm going to read it out loud, and I want you to jot down what you think are the conflict and the climax in particular. The complications take a long time, so you don't have to write them all down or whatever. And then the consequences at the end, okay? So I want you to write down those things, and then we're going to share them in groups and on chat, okay? So I will read Genesis 22, and you take your notes. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. Oh, I got to give you a little context here. So that whole thing about Abram not having any kids, do you think God kept his promise? He sure did, yeah. So he gives him a kid, Isaac. Now, there's a lot of twists and turns in that story, but Isaac grows up, he's a young man, and so Abraham knows. He's like, this is the guy, right? This is the promised child, and he's probably got in the back of his mind, he's like, yeah, there was a promised child to Eve too. Maybe this guy's the sin crusher, you know? Maybe this is the snake crusher. This is the guy, right? And God has already said the promise is going to go through him. So this is all the promises of God. It's like focused in on Isaac, my heir, my boy. This is it, right? I love him. This is my hope for the future. Patriarch is not without a family. I've got Isaac. So that's where we pick up. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. That's a good way to answer God, by the way. Here I am. Then God said, take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him two of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. All right, take a moment. Jot down. In this story, what's the conflict, complication, the climax, and the consequences? All right, if you're in the room, you can go ahead and discuss at your table what you identified as those four things. And if you're in the online, you can share those in chat. What do you think are the conflict, complication, climax, and consequences? I'm going to give you just a minute or two here. I know you could probably talk a long time about this story, but I want to make sure we cover it before the time is up. All right, go ahead and share any final comment you want to. All right. Let me tell you what I identified here as in terms of the conflict, the complication, the climax, and the consequences. You can compare notes. I'm not saying that these are definitively the right thing. I actually can see a couple of different places where you could say maybe it's this or maybe it's that. That's part of the process of pondering a story. In fact, the process of saying, is this the climactic moment? Is this the turning point? Is this the problem? Is that the problem? Actually, it's like turning facets on a diamond and saying, oh, I see it from that way. A really good story tends to have kind of multiple layers of this. But I want to give you what I think is one of the main ones here that structures it, okay? The problem at the start is fairly straightforward, right? God just asked him to sacrifice his son. Just on a very straightforward, obvious level, killing your son, your only son, the son that you love, is a monstrous idea. It's a monstrous idea. But it's even worse if you've been reading the story and you know what Isaac represents. Like, we think in terms of the affection we have for our family members when we think about that. But Abraham also has the weight of saving the world, that God has said, I'm going to do it through you, and I'm going to do it through Isaac. This is the way the entire world's going to be put back together. It's through your family and this guy. Kill him. What the heck? How do you even figure that out? I'm not just going to lose my son. I'm going to lose all hope for my future and the world. That's what's going on. That's a conflict right there. Complication? Can you imagine that journey? He walks and he's got a choice. Each step along the way, I can leave these guys back here with the pack. I could turn around. My son stops me partway up. He sees the problem here. I got a knife. Got fire. Nothing to kill. Abraham gets up there. He actually has to go through the process of building an altar, laying out the wood, binding his son, grabbing a knife. Every moment along the way is a complication. What is he going to do? What is he going to do? What is he going to do? Of course, the climactic moment is when he takes the knife. And now here's the place where you might want to say, which part is the pivotal turning point? Is it Abraham's willingness to do it? Or is it the moment when God says, don't kill him? Because both of those seem like the turning point, right? Like, there's something about the story that if Abraham doesn't go through with it, everything falls apart. This test of his faith, suddenly, if he doesn't raise the knife, then is he obeying? But on the other hand, the truly definitive thing is when God says, do not kill him. I want him to live and not die. Because that reveals something, doesn't it? It tells you something very important about God. It changes the story really definitively, because the conflict that's behind the other two conflicts I identified, losing your son and losing the promise, is this God I've been following all this time any good? Is he worthy of this? Is he the sort of God you could trust to save the world, because he's saying, kill him? And then we find out that God is not that sort of God. In terms of the consequences, it's the reiteration of the promise. That something has been revealed about Abraham, something has been revealed about God, and now this promise can be fully understood. This is the kind of relationship we're going to have. And so he reiterates, I'm going to give you a nation, I'm going to give you the land, you're going to be more numerous than the stars and the sand on the sea. This is a powerful story, isn't it? One of the ways that we get the power from the story is meditation. Once we've actually made observations about it, we don't just go along and say, okay, now let me think it through. Because the point is not just to get through the Bible, it's to get the Bible through you, right? And so this is the step that Jim and I added. We were like, oh, we're restarting Bible Savvy. Let's teach people how to meditate. And meditating on a story is a particular skill. Sometimes the basic idea of meditation is kind of prayerful reflection. Okay, so you're reading the Bible and you're prayerfully reflecting on it. But when it comes to a story, like when you're doing it in some passages, you can just grab a phrase and it's short enough that you can kind of ponder it and reflect on it for a while. But when you're reading a story, how do you do it? How do you grab onto something in here? I find the easiest way to meditate on a story is to go through the story again after I've observed it and actually say, what would it feel like to be this character? What would they be experiencing? You imaginatively put yourself in that place. And so that's what I actually want us to do right now. To say, if I were in Abraham's shoes, now you don't have to do Abraham, you could pick Isaac if you wanted to, the two characters that are here, but Abraham's probably a good one. If I were in his shoes, what would I be thinking or feeling right now? So I'm going to read through this again. I'm going to pause at moments, and I want you to just ponder that. And this isn't just thinking about it. You're talking to God. This is how I would feel. This is what it would be like. Why? And if you've got questions, you say, why did you do that, God? How could you put him through that? Whatever it is, you prayerfully talk to God about this passage. So go ahead and get comfortable, however you'd like to sit as I do this. But I'm going to read this, and we're going to take some time to meditate on it. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. And when he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. If I were doing this in the morning when I do Bible Savvy, I would probably go through it again. It's a really, really rich one. Each moment there, Abraham's responses, you say, how could you say that? What could be going through your heart and mind as you do that? As you read through this, maybe you notice some things that suggested other parts of the Bible. You're like, that sounds really familiar. Your son, your only son, the son that you love. Next time you hear that, you know what happens to sons like that. They die, and yet their lives are spared. There's a lot of richness in this. What meditation does is it slows you down so that you see all of that, you feel all of it. It gets in you, it changes you, it shapes you. I think the practice of meditation on Scripture is one of the most important practices you can develop, because then the Bible is having its way with you. I'm going over, and I don't care, okay? If you guys need to leave the room or you need to leave online, fine. I got more things to say. So another 10 minutes or so. Next thing after meditation is you formulate a message. Here's the basic idea of a message. try to get a single simple sentence to say, this is what this is all about. You don't have to sum up everything, but you take the observations you saw and the things God showed you as you meditated, and you try to focus it in and say, if I could put this on a bumper sticker or a meme or something that just sort of sums it up in a single sentence, what would I say? It doesn't have to be something that seems super clever or whatever. It just needs to be something that says the truth of what you saw. Okay, so when I was reading Genesis 15 that we read earlier, God keeps impossible promises. That's all it takes. Like, you don't have to figure out something more than that. Like, sometimes you write a message and you think, well, that sounds kind of obvious, right? Like, anybody could have come up with that. That's fine. If it's true, it's worth saying, okay? So don't stress about that. But think about this one. In Genesis 22, what would your message be? Oh, actually, let me give you another tip before we talk about what the message would be. When you are reading a narrative, there are two things that really help with the message, okay? One is this. God is the main character of the biblical story. Now, there are primary characters in individual narratives, but when you are looking at the big picture, if you don't say, what's God doing in this situation, you have probably missed the point, okay? So if it's not really, you can't say how it works in relation to God, maybe it's not a message here, okay? Second, distinguish between what is prescriptive and descriptive, okay? So when you're reading a narrative and you've observed it and you're like, oh, this is what the characters did, sometimes the characters don't do good things, right? So there are times when just because the character does it doesn't mean, well, I'm supposed to follow their example. Sometimes there are things that just happen in a situation and it doesn't mean it's good. It's just part of the story. So you need to identify which things in here are things in the story that I'm supposed to do. That's prescriptive. Which things are just things that happened in this story? This is really important in the rest of Genesis. Truth be told, everybody is pretty much a bad guy here, okay? Like, we've seen some glimmers of faith here with Abraham already, but Abraham does some pretty terrible stuff, and his children are even worse. So, as you read through, don't think, I should be like Jacob. If you're like Jacob, your life will be in ruins, but by the grace of God, which is sort of the point of the story of Jacob. That's a freebie right there. Okay. Distinguish between what is prescriptive and descriptive. So in this story, when you look at it, you're not supposed to say, maybe God wants me to sacrifice someone, or he's putting me to the test or whatever. You do not need to say, now I'm going to interpret every situation in my life as if God was saying you have to give up the most important thing or whatever. Those sorts of things are often people will look at the story and say that's the main idea. Now, there may be situations where God is calling you to give up something you desperately want or something you have your hopes on or whatever. But you need to step back and say, is this story requiring that of me, right? So just because it's happening in the story doesn't mean it's prescriptive for your life. What you do is you step back and you look for a principle that says, what does this tell me about God? And then you look at your life, okay? So in this case, these are examples from Genesis 15. We don't have time for you guys to write things down in one sentence, but you could have had that. Okay, here are some things that you could have come up with in terms of a message from Genesis 22. Let me see how I can formulate this. I got 4 or 5 written down here. I'm like, which ones do I want to talk about? What was that? This is a powerful story to me. I'm sorry. All right. I was going to interact with you guys and have you tell me things, so my things are all jumbled thoughts. Here's a message you could have. When you look at the observation of God said, you are going to sacrifice your son, and then he gives him back, saying, God is worthy of our trust, even in the face of death. So this is actually what the rest of the Bible says. There are situations where the promises of God look like they have ended in death, and yet they survive through resurrection, right? You've seen this pattern before. There's obviously a big one. But this is what goes on. Let me share with you in Hebrews. This is how the rest of the Bible interprets this passage. By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go to a place that he would later receive as an inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he didn't know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were his heirs with him in the same promise. For he was looking forward to a city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, even Sarah, that's his wife, who is past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so, from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They didn't receive the things that were promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country that's not of their own. If they had been thinking of the country that they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. So let me show you this. Let me go back to the Genesis 22. Okay. Look at this. What does he say to the servants in verse 5? We will come back. Abraham doesn't know what's about to happen. He doesn't know how that's going to happen. But he knows God promised this son will be the father of the nation. Look what he says here. God will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. He doesn't know there's a ram in the thicket. He just knows somehow we're going to get out of this, right? Somehow Isaac will live. When you get to Hebrews fills in some of the things that are going on in his head. He figured he can raise the dead. And so in a way he did. Here's a really interesting thing about this story as you go into the future of the people of Israel. They look back at Isaac and they say, he's our patriarch, right? Like he's the guy we all came from. We were all on that altar. None of us should have lived. All of us were supposed to go. We only exist because God brought us back from the brink of death and interjected the ram. Someone died in our place, or we wouldn't exist at all. And they look at that story over and over again in their history. It's the one that makes sense out of their existence. That you're slaves coming out of Egypt. You just saw the angel of death sweep through, and the only reason you were spared is the same reason Isaac was spared. Something died and the blood was above your door. And again, the sacrifice is on and on. We only exist, we only live because the ram was in our place. And one day, someone actually does send his son, his only son, the one he loves, and dies in all of our place. It's absolutely profound. Abraham didn't know all of that was going on, but he knew the God who had promised, if he says the promise is through him, he's going to raise the dead. He could do it. He totally can. And so this is actually the pattern. You don't see it quite as dramatically in all the other stories of Genesis, but it's there when you start to, once you realize it, you're like, it's there. Every story gets to a place, like every big character story, gets to a place where they are in the pit where nothing can be done about it in their own human situation. They're dead. They are on the line. They are laying on the altar, and it's over for them. But in that moment of death, God raises them up by his power, not by theirs. So you see this, okay? Let me give you a couple of examples. This is the really dramatic one, the earlier one that we talked about. Sarah cannot have children. She is barren. She says that her womb is dead. But out of it comes life. Jacob, this scoundrel, is Abraham's grandson. Jacob spends his entire life making a Babel out of his life. What's Babel, right? Babel is we're going to make a name for ourselves. We're going to make something for ourselves. We're going to do this. He swindles everybody. He tricks everybody. He does everything he can, every person he comes along with, until he has ruined everything, and the conflict is everywhere, and he's saying, I have to go home, and my brother who wants to kill me is waiting for me, and I can't do anything about it. And so he's got a scheme for this. Jacob says, well, you know what? If I send him a bunch of gifts, he just keeps sending his brother gifts. He keeps sending his brother gifts. I can find a way out of this. I'll do all this, and then I'll show up after he's nice and happy with me, and I'll be okay. He's got a scheme for everything. But in the middle of the night, he knows it's not going to work. He cannot sleep. He is restless, and he wanders out into the wilderness. He's all by himself. And a man comes. Don't tell us who the man is. Let you guys figure that one out. And he wrestles with him all night long. Jacob wrestles with the man and wrestles with the man. Why won't you bless me? Why won't you take care of me? Why won't you do this? And the man breaks his hip. So Jacob, the guy who was the self-made man, thought he had it all figured out, but ruined every relationship in his life when he's finally limping, completely helpless, cannot save himself. That's when life comes. That's when he's reconciled with his brother. That's when the blessing comes. Joseph takes up a quarter of the book of Genesis, his story, the story of his brothers. And Joseph gets sold into slavery. He is in the pit more times than just about anybody. It's just again and again, every situation. He gets thrown down. What can he do? He's sold into slavery by his brothers. He's falsely accused of something. He gets forgotten in prison again and again. And then a famine comes to the land. There is no way. All of the curses of Genesis 3, it's happening to him. It's right there. It's Cain and Abel, but he's got 11 Cains, you know what I mean? He cannot save himself. He is in the pit, and no one is coming to get him. And it's from there, when he is helpless and can do nothing out of death, that God raises his life. So, let me get back around to this. We'll talk about what you do. How does this connect with us? Okay? Remember what I said the purpose of the book of Genesis was? To show God's people their identity and their purpose by showing the story of their origin. Let me tell you your family legacy. Abraham was a nobody. He had no children and no land and no nothing, but only a promise. And only faith in God. That's all he had. And when he was in the pit of death, and then when his children were in the pit of death, when everything had fallen apart for each member of his family, that is when God all by himself raised him up. This is how we become the people that change the world. Not by saying, I can figure it out, I can make something of myself, I can do this, I can build a Babel around me. But when we say, I got nothing, I can't save myself. All I can do is trust that God will be there for me. Those are the kinds of people that change the world. Those are the kinds of people that bring back shalom. It is through that relinquishing of us being in charge. It's taking the tree from the knowledge of good and evil and saying, I can define good and evil for myself. I can figure out the right way to do things. I've got this in hand. And we say, no, I don't. I've only got you. That's our family legacy. Galatians 3 says this. This is talking about you guys, okay? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Understand then that those who have faith are children of Abraham. You ever sing that song? Either you're teaching Sunday school or you're in Sunday school. Father Abraham has many sons. I never understood that until I was older. I don't know why we sang it, but it had emotions. It was great. But this is the truth. Who are those stars in the sky? Who are the ones that when Abraham tried to count them, who did they represent? Those who have faith. So in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. See that covenant idea? If we have faith like Abraham, we're in the covenant, and God becomes our Father. We become His children, and He cares for us. For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There's neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed. Okay, that offspring that was promised, heirs according to the promise. All of the promises that God was going to bring back shalom and give us a place and make us a great nation. Guess who the great nation is? God's people. God's people. So, the Abrahamic covenant in the book of Genesis gets passed down through these generations to the nation of Israel. But then, the Messiah comes along, the promised seed that would save the people. Paul in Galatians makes a big deal of saying the seed that God promised specifically was Jesus. And so everyone who is in Jesus is an heir of the Abrahamic covenant, and that means us, the people who have trust in God. We are the anti-Babel kingdom, bringing a little bit of shalom to the world by bearing his image. God is our patriarch. He is taking care of us. And the way we do it is through faith. Saying, I got nothing. I'm in the pit of death. I cannot save myself. Here I am. Lead me where you want to go. We walk in the way of Abraham. All right. Took you like too late. At least some people are still hanging around. Thank you very much. Here's on your way out. You're going to get a survey in your email. Please fill that out. Give me some feedback about how this went. We're going to be doing more of these over the course of the year. Each time we get to an Old Testament book, I'm going to do a preview of the Old Testament book because those are the ones that people usually need a little bit more help with, and they're really fun to talk about. So we'll be doing Exodus sometime in January, so if you give me feedback, it'll help me tailor that to make it a better experience. Maybe we won't be, in exactly this format or whatever, but we probably will be. So let's give me feedback, especially if you're online, because it would really help me make that experience good for you. Let me pray, and then we'll head out. Heavenly Father, we're thankful that we can call you that you entered into a covenant, that you made impossible promises to us, and you have kept them. All of your promises are yes and amen in your Son, Jesus. God, we pray that you would increase our faith. God, there are so many times when we are in the pit and we think it's our job to build a kingdom, to save ourselves, to find a scheme, to rescue. But God, we put our trust in you. God, give us faith to trust you. God, I pray in a time like this, when a whole lot of us look around and it feels like things are falling apart in the world and in our lives, and we don't know what's coming next. We don't know how this is all going to pan out. But in this moment, we know the God that we trust. And so, God, we pray that you would give us the faith of Abraham, that you would give us trust in your Son, Jesus, and that every day we would thank you that we live because he died and was raised to life. We pray this in his name. Amen. Go in peace.